my good, very vocal, willing to answer questions students. And today we'll pick up where we left off yesterday. We're talking about colonial industry. First of all, what is industry? What does it mean to have industry? It is. It's like manufacturing, like what people do for a living. What was the number one profession of people living in the colonies? What did most people do for a living? They were farmers. Okay, agriculture was the leading industry, involving about 90% of people. We've come a long way in America. Do you guys even know a farmer? Yeah. Some of you do. We've come a long way from some of you not even knowing a farmer to 90% of every human was a farmer. Now, depending upon where you lived, it depended upon what kind of agriculture you did. Chances are, if you lived in Maryland or Virginia along the Chesapeake, what were you growing? Tobacco. Very good. Though wheat was also spread throughout the Chesapeake, the main crop grown in there was tobacco. The fertile middle colonies, they produced grain. The middle colonies were places like Pennsylvania, New York. Those are the middle colonies. They were like America's. They're also called the bread colonies because of the enormous quantities of grain that they were producing. Fishing was also all these other industries pale in comparison to agriculture, just so you know. They're not even remotely close to the number of people, but people still were fishermen. It was rewarding, and it was pursued throughout every American colony because every American colony had some sort of coastline or rivers. And harvesting fish from the sea was a large industry in New England. It was a greater industry. Does anybody know what fish they sought after the most? I don't know how you would know this. If anybody would take a guess. I think it's what they have at like Long John Silver's and Captain D's if you go get a fish dinner. Cod. Yeah, cod is their number one. So, in order to meet the demand for people to be fishermen, what do you got to have to be a fisherman out on the sea? A boat. And so shipbuilding was also a very lucrative industry for many Americans in the Northeast. Not a lot of ships being built in the Southeast. So bustling commerce overseas in the colonies made many colonists very wealthy, especially in New England, New York, and Pennsylvania. So the reasons why they're able to do this is because a lot of the provisions that were needed in the sugar islands in the Caribbean, because they're only growing sugar there, because that's very profitable. However, those people that live there still have to eat. Well, the food that they get is coming from these bread colonies of New York, Pennsylvania, places like that. And because of that, the people in Pennsylvania not only are growing the things and getting wealthy, but they're shipping it there too and getting wealthy and building the boats that they're shipping it in. And so there is a great amount of wealth being amassed by several wealthy people in the Northeast. Okay? So with the Caribbean sugar islands being furnished with food and forest products, while they're there, these colonial merchants are also shipping things like gold and wine and oranges across the ocean to Spain and England to be exchanged for industrial goods or to just straight out be sold for profit. So manufacturing the colonies is definitely way beneath agriculture because most people are farmers, but there was some manufacturing. As a rule, workers could get ahead in a rich soil America by tilling up the land and making their way, and whatever they have left over, they can distill it. What does that mean? What does it mean to distill something? Distillation, or you guys know what that means? Turned into alcohol. So depending upon what kind of crop that you're growing, depending on what kind of alcohol you made. If you're growing a lot of, if you have sugar available and molasses, you make rum. If you're making corn, if you grow corn, you make whiskey. So it all depended upon what you were growing. And a lot of people made liquor. And in places like Appalachia, it was almost used as currency. Like people would carry their jug around with them and trade a drink or fill up a glass or fill up a different jug, and they would trade with it. It was used almost as currency, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it becomes very important as our government becomes the American government, and we want to tax things like whiskey, and then it becomes an issue. All right, we also have things like beaver pelts. Beaver pelts. America was, places in England and France, they saw themselves as the fashionable places, the places that created fads, created fashion. And it was very fashionable to have clothing and hats made from beaver pelts. And handsome beaver hats were manufactured in quantity despite a lot of British restrictions. And so, people could trap beavers and do trade with Native Americans to get the beaver pelts to sell to markets in Europe. In addition, household manufacturing, including spinning and weaving, and cottage industries, meaning you do it at your house, were largely kept going by women. So, and just like in all pioneer countries, strong-backed laborers and skilled craftspeople, they were hard to find. So when you were able to find someone who was skilled with a needle and thread or skilled at making beaver hats or whatever, it was, those people were in high demand. It's not like the throwaway economy we have today. Like, you buy a pair of shoes today and they wear out, you just throw them away and go buy a new pair of shoes. As an adult, you may have one pair of shoes your entire life living in this time period, and when they wore out, you take them and get them repaired because shoes were expensive and difficult to make. So people that could make high-quality goods were definitely in demand. We also, down at the bottom left there, I didn't mention lumbering. Lumbering was a very important manufacturing activity, as you would imagine, because especially places that were building ships, you got to build them out of something. They got to come from somewhere. So lumbering was very important to shipbuilders, particularly in New England. Okay, so questions on these types of industries and really what people did for a living. They had a pretty fair amount of diversity. Obviously, nowhere near as diverse an economy as we have today, but it was just as good as anywhere else in the world. All right. So, moving right along. Okay. There were two. I want to talk to you about some of these churches that we've been discussing. We know about the Anglican Church, which was founded by King Henry VIII in the 1500s after the Protestant Revolution. He wanted to, create his own church because he wanted to make some changes from the Catholic Church. And that's what the Anglican Church is. And in practice, it's very similar to the Catholic Church. They just don't have valid sacraments. They don't adhere to the Pope, things of that nature. So both of these churches I'm going to tell you about. The other one's the Congregationalist Church, and I'll come back to it. That's the Puritan Church, okay? So first came the Catholic Church, And then King Henry VIII didn't like that. And so in England, he created his own church called the Church of England. And then the Puritans, they wanted to purify all traces of Catholicism from the Anglican Church. And so they were extremes. They were like separatists. And so they created their own church called the Congregationalist Church or the Puritans. Okay, are you following me? All right, so both of these churches are tax supported, meaning if you live in the community, you pay taxes, and that money goes to supporting the church, paying the preacher. Both of these churches did this. And a considerable segment of the population and communities throughout the colonies did not worship any kind of church. And yet those colonies maintained an established religion with only a minority of people belonging to it. So the Church of England, whose members were commonly called Anglicans, they were most prominent in the colonies of Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, part of New York. Most of the colonies had the official faith of the Anglican Church as their official faith. And the thing about it is the Church of England, who's in charge of it? Well, who's in charge of England? The king. He's also in charge of the church. He's like, if there was such a thing, he's like the Pope of the Church of England, in addition to being the king of England. There is no such thing as a Pope of the Church of England. That doesn't exist. So in America, a lot of people would not only paying their homage to the Church of England, but in turn, they have to be honorable to the king. And that was in the majority of the colonies. So imagine how far people have to be pushed to go from like having your religious leader and your political leader being the same person to wanting to completely separate from that. So there's a lot of things that are going to happen in the coming years that push people away from England. And that's what our next period is all about, our next section. So the Congregationalist Church, where is that one mostly found? Where are the Puritans found mostly? Where did the Puritans go to start with? Plymouth, yeah, that's right, New England. And they were a very influential church, which had grown out of Puritanism. And were formally established in every New England colony except for one. Can anybody guess the independent-minded colony that did not have an official religion? Rhode Island. Very good. Remember, Rhode Island likes to think for themselves, welcome all comers. But in every other, in Plymouth and Massachusetts and Connecticut, they all had the Congregationalist Church as their official religion, formally established. At first, Massachusetts taxed residents to support the church, but later they relented and exempted members who belonged to other denominations, as long as they were Protestant denominations. Other Protestant denominations that were prevalent were Presbyterianism. It was closely related to the Congregationalist Church, but had a few slight exceptions. Just like every Protestants can just create their own religion and make it up. And so a lot of these religions are very similar with slight differences, very slight differences. Just like the Puritans and the Presbyterians have slight differences. Okay? Anglicans in the New World were at a pretty significant disadvantage because the King of England did not provide them with leadership in the New World, like a bishop. There was no clergy. Okay? So many Anglican young men who wanted to be ministers had to travel to England to be ordained. That's something the Anglican Church took from there has to be a line of succession to the authority. So even as we approached the American Revolution, there was serious talk of creating an American bishop, a person that could at least travel throughout America and ordain ministers as needed. So religious toleration has got a long way to go in America during this colonial period. A long way to go, especially when it comes to being tolerant of other religions. It's probably better now than it has been. However, a part of that is because fewer people even have religion nowadays. But as far as discrimination goes for people's religion, probably Muslims get it worse than anybody in America today, but that has not always been the case. Throughout America's history, the most widely discriminated religious group were Catholics. Roman Catholics were still generally discriminated against, not only in England, but also in America. However, there were a lot fewer Catholics in America than there were in England, and so therefore the discrimination was here. There just wasn't as many Catholics. Because of that, many colonies didn't even find it necessary to make anti-Catholic laws, because there just weren't enough Catholics to bother with. Whereas in England, they were killing Catholics at some points. Like, you're Catholic, I'm killing you because of your religion. So, in colonies that did have anti-Catholic laws, they were not very strictly enforced. And in general, people could pretty much worship as they pleased in the colonies. Until you try to move in next to somebody, then they don't want you there. Okay? But, religion's always been an important aspect of American life. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We talked about how things that happened in Europe affected the colonies, like the Protestant Revolution and King Henry VIII making his own religion. And in all the colonial churches, the level of fervidness, the level of the intensity of one's beliefs was beginning to wane, especially during the early 18th century. By the early 1700s, people's religious intensity was much less intense than it was a century earlier. And Puritan churches in particular were beginning to sag under the weight of these burdens. First, they had very elaborate theological doctrines, and they were very compromising to try to, make people want to join. But in doing so, they alienate their intensely fervent religious people. So, even in the Puritan church, some worshipers were beginning to proclaim that human beings were not necessarily predetermined anymore. A doctrine that was totally against Calvinistic beliefs, doing away with this idea of predestination. They were even coming up and saying that they agreed with Catholic ideas, that it had nothing to do with your birth, but how you acted, like your behavior, how well you treated people, if you gave them charity and loved your neighbor. If you did those things, you could be saved, which is a Catholic idea. You had to be good and do good to go to heaven, as opposed to just being predetermined. And so what this idea that these people are reintroducing into Calvinism is called free will. They are introducing individual free will to determine a person's eternal fate. So the church, not the Puritan church, is being pressured by these heresies. A heresy is just something that goes against church teaching. They're being pressured by these heresies, which a few churches grudgingly conceded that spiritual conversion was not necessarily needed for church membership. But the stage is set for a religious arousal, for things to begin to grow, a revival, if you will. You guys ever heard of a revival? Well, revivals are born out of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening. Known as the Great Awakening, it exploded in the 1730s and 1740s and swept through the colonies like prairie grass on fire. The awakening was first ignited in Massachusetts. In fact, it was Northampton, Massachusetts, where this man who's depicted here and who's speaking to masses of crowds, his name is Jonathan Edwards. Perhaps at this time the deepest theological mind in America in the 1730s and 40s. He proclaimed with a burning righteousness that it was folly to believe in salvation through works, and affirmed the need to depend on God's grace. So he rejects the Catholic belief of individual free will and says, you are scum, you are worthless, you are not capable, you deserve to burn in hell, but God loves you. And if you believe, you'll be saved. It is only through God's grace that you can be saved, because you as a human are a dog. This is what he does, okay? So he paints he's a great public speaker, one of the best public speakers in American history. And he paints very detailed pictures in people's mind of the landscape of hell and the eternal torments of the damned. And he plays on people, I don't want to say he plays on people's emotions, but he incites people emotionally. He creates an emotional connection between God and people. And people begin to believe that just because they're having an emotional reaction, that must be the Holy Spirit at work. Whenever you feel it, then it must be God at work. That is a very New Age Protestant idea. Okay? So, it's a good thing that you're having an emotional reaction, because that is God putting the Holy Spirit at work. Okay? So, Edwards' preaching style was copied by lots of different people and closely learned and stylized. And 4 years, during the Great Awakening, another English preacher in America, whose name was George Whitefield, he used a different style of preaching, which revolutionized spiritual life. A former bartender, Whitefield was an orator with special gifts. You guys know what an orator is? I'm doing it right now. Public speaking. He is an excellent public speaker. He had a voice that boomed. I mean, boomed. He could stand on a stump, and there could be thousands of people around, and they could all hear him. Imagine us just going to the gym in an enclosed room, and everybody sitting there as quiet as possible, it's still kind of hard to hear somebody speak from across the gym. And that's in a room with like acoustics. Imagine us standing on the football field and I'm on one goal line and you're at the other goal line and I'm trying to speak to you and it's just us. Now I want you to imagine I'm on one goal line and you're on the other goal line and in between us are 1,000 people breathing, muffling about, shushing their kids. And you can still hear me. That's George Whitefield. It's like his voice had a megaphone in it. So he had very rare gifts as a public speaker, as his magnificent voice boomed over thousands of enthralled listeners in an open field. And he triumphantly toured the colonies like a rock star, a Jesus rock star. Trumpeting his message of human helplessness. You are weak. You're sorry. You're just a weak, worthless human. But there's hope for you as long as you believe and accept God's grace. It doesn't matter. Remember, it doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with what you do. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how good you are. It still pales in comparison to God. And only your belief will save you. And only God's grace will save you. This is the message of the Great Awakening, a message that prevails in many Protestant faiths today. So, Whitefield soon inspired a lot of American preachers to preach in his way, in a way that still exists today. Like, you guys ever seen these big mega churches on TV? And they get you whipped up into a frenzy and people are dancing and shaking and quit. George Whitefield. That's where it comes from. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's pretty much at this point American as apple pie. But this emotionalism is this new idea that emerges in the Great Awakening. This emotional connection that many new denominations adhere to. Emotionalism. So the Great Awakening has, led to a lot of changes in American religion. We've already talked about the Congregationalist Church and the Anglican Church, and we talked a little bit about the Presbyterians. The Congregationalists and the Presbyterians completely split after this over the issue of how your religious conversion should be. And many of the people who disagreed with either of those, they just went to the Baptist faith. Baptist and Methodist churches grew exponentially as a result of this, because they were able to have that emotionalism. Whereas older Presbyterian churches and Puritan churches, not very emotional, very stoic, very much like Catholic church. There's no emotion involved. Like, if you do these things and God is there, if you don't believe it, shame on you. So that's a Catholic idea. But this new emotionalism where you go and you start crying and you shake and that is a new idea. And so the Baptist faith and Methodist faith grew exponentially during this time. So whenever there's a split in religions, that's called a schism. And so the schisms that were set off in many denominations greatly increased the competitiveness of American churches. Churches were competing for membership. And so this encourages a fresh new wave of missionaries throughout America, particularly among the Native American population and the slave population, allowing them to be civilized and Christianized. Whereas before, the Puritans, they're not allowing black people or Native Americans in their churches because they are not saved. Whereas here, in this new Great Awakening, if these people are capable of experiencing an emotional conversion, they too can be saved by the grace of God. Okay? Questions on the Great Awakening. It's a big deal. It causes so many changes to the future of American government, religion, and politics. So many changes. Are we good? Questions? All right, awesome. If you have questions, don't hesitate to contact me. That's all.